Today our topic is Western Front. Western Front is very important landscape. The First World War was fought there and the casualties are immeasurable. The Western Front of 400 plus miles stretch of land weaving through France and Belgium from the Swiss border to the North Sea was the decisive front during the First World War, whichever side won there. Either the Central Powers or the Entente would be able to claim victory for their respective alliance. Despite the global nature of the conflict, much of the world remembers the First World War through the lens of the Western Front, in large part thanks to the success of Erich Maria. Remarks classic. All quiet on the Western Front. Many articles have been written on the Western Front. The article looks at the war on the Western Front from 1914 to 18, its major events, battles and strategies. The contents we will touch in this lecture: number first, the introduction; the second, the war of movement; and third, the early trench battles in 1915 and in 1916 the additional battles, and the Somme, and in 1917 the year of desperation and the British Army ascendant, and in 1918 the year of decision. In many ways, the war on the Western Front began as a fundamentally Franco-German conflict and one with deep historical roots. The region had been of critical importance for French security for centuries. In 1600s, Sebastian Lee Prestry de Vauban, 1633 to 1707, famously sought to design and build an interlinking series of forts, which he claimed and called Précaire, to shelter France's eastern border from attacks that might come through Central Europe. There is a longue durée concept of fortified defense running from Vauban through to the great forts that existed in 1914, Verdun, Belfort, and Toul, and the later Maginot Line. There is a similar continuity running across Franco-German conflicts from 1870 to 1940, which helps to contextualize the war on the Western Front. In 1870 to 1871, a coalition of German states led by Prussia quickly defeated France's fielded forces in a matter of weeks before becoming bogged down in a lengthy People's War. This is a similar continuity running across Franco-German conflicts from 1870 to 1940, which helps to contextualize the war on the Western Front. In 1870-71, a coalition of German states, led by Prussia, quickly defeated France's field forces in a matter of weeks before becoming bogged down in a lengthy People's War. Volkskrieg, we can say that in German language, something we might now call an insurgency. The humiliation of such a resounding defeat, which led to the loss of two of France's eastern provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, coupled with the overthrow of the French imperial government and its replacement with the Third Republic, left France weak and exposed. The vulnerability was contrasted against the immense financial, military and industrial strength of the United German State that arose out of the Franco-Prussian War. After 1871, French diplomacy was largely concerned with preventing another crushing defeat at the hands of its strengthened neighbor. It was this imperative that led France to sign a defensive alliance with France in 1895, thus setting the basic geographic parameters of the First World War 20 years before it began. The alliance with Russia was awkward for a number of reasons. Politically, It allied Europe's most liberal state with its most autocratic. It also necessitated significant investment and financial aid for a Russian state still struggling to industrialize and modernize. Of principal importance was Russia's ability to mobilize its vast armies quickly and threaten Germany's borders in the event of war. This would ensure that Germany could not defeat its enemies one at a time, but would be forced to separate its forces between two distant theaters, thus spreading its forces dangerously thin. To ensure that Russia would be able to mobilize quickly, France invested substantial sums to build new strategic railways that would better link the Russian heartland with its western border with Germany. In 1914, these new rail lines were rapidly approaching completion. All of this put Germany in a very precarious position. Surrounded by hostile powers, Germany would very likely find itself fighting in a two-front war in the event of a general European conflict. Recognizing that it was unlikely to be able to prevail under such circumstances, Germany knew it would have to quickly overwhelm one of its enemies before turning to fight the other. Given the rapid success German forces enjoyed in 1870 over France and Eastern Europe's daunting geography, German strategic planners decided to array the overwhelming majority of their field forces against France, passing through Belgium on the way in a grand sweeping motion known as the Schlieffen Plan. The pressure to quickly defeat one enemy compelled Germany to act swiftly and decisively. The moment of war. The war on the Western Front began on 3 August 1914, with Germany aggressively marching into Belgium and Luxembourg. France had already mobilized but was waiting within her borders for Germany to make the first move through the Low Countries. The next day, Britain declared war on Germany, setting the stage for the war on the Western Front. In Belgium, the Liege and Namur forts, a complex series of reinforced concrete blockhouses and retractable artillery positions, proved to be no match for the heavy Krupp and Skoda howitzers with which the German army marched to war. Despite Belgian resistance, Liege and Namur both fell within a matter of days, opening the war for German armies to invade France and to begin the execution of their so-called Schlieffen Plan. This entailed the German attempt to sweep around the French left flank, take Paris from behind, and force France to capitulate in a matter of weeks. Belgian forces continued to fight throughout the war, desperately holding on to the small corner of their national homeland that remained in Allied hands for the entirety of the conflict. Meanwhile, France made its own offensive further south into Alsace and Lorraine, the provinces lost to Germany at the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. While there was political reason for this thrust, it was also the only area that France could attack into without risking British support. The German breach of Belgian neutrality decidedly pushed Britain into the war on the side of France. The French offensives met uniformly with disaster, led by incapable officers. French formations forlornly groped their way forward without sufficient reconnaissance, and counter battles favored the more careful German forces. Even when the French won local success, their abysmal command and control meant that successful advances petered out, were unsupported, and were ultimately pushed back to more organized German forces. Tactically, the Germans performed extraordinarily well during this period. France lost over 3 lakh dead in 1914, making it France's second most deadly year of the war. Operationally, the Germans under Helmut von Moltke the Younger, 1848-1916, stretched themselves perilously thin, chasing after France and British troops in headlong retreat after the initial encounter battles in August. The German plan required a rapid, coordinated sweep that envisioned the First and Second German armies advancing rapidly along the French, British and Belgian left flank. Covering such a vast area, however, proved to be very difficult logistically, and the German armies began to drift apart. This drift was first noticed by British reconnaissance aircraft and was quickly communicated up through the command structure. The time had come for the Entente forces, which had been rapidly falling back before a seemingly unstoppable German onslaught, to stop and fight. From 5 September 1914, French and British formations fought their way into a gap between the German First and Second Armies, part of a struggle called the Battle, sometimes Miracle, of the Marne. Entente forces frantically raced into the fray. Some were even shuttled to the battlefield in commandeered automobiles. The famous Persian taxis and the Parisian taxis that carried French troops toward a defense to the capital. Entente and German forces fought over nearly entire length of the front, making the Marne one of the largest engagements of the war, as well as one of the most important. Over the next week, Entente forces continued to push into the gap, threatening to split the German forces and separating Alexander von Kluck's 1846 to 1934 First Army from the rest of the German forces. The Germans had no choice but to retreat, stopping at a line behind Verdun, Soissons, and Reims, when renewed French attacks were halted by the once more cohesive German forces. Joseph Joffre, 1852-1931. Commander-in-Chief of the French Army, ordered troops to move to the far left flank and try to outflank the Germans from the north. The effort was repulsed and countered by a German attempt to turn the French flank in turn. The so-called race to the sea saw both forces make ineffectual attempts to turn the northern flank until they found themselves at the North Sea, with no flanks left to turn. The Western Front, as we think of it, came into being, a solid front from the sea to the Alps, with only one way through straight ahead. There were a few attempts to break through this line before the winter weather set in and exhausted. Overstretched units became incapable of action. Most notable was the first battles of Ypres, immortalized in the popular image of German schoolboys marching gleefully in close order to attack. The attacks were costly failures. The infantry, attacking with limited artillery support, had no chance of success, even against the fragmentary trenches of November 1914. The French made a similar effort at the First Battle of Ortles, 16 to 18 December 1914, despite a more robust artillery preparation than the Germans had been able to muster at Ypres. The French attack was an irredeemable failure. Trench networks could not be broken by hasty offensives, but rather had to be systematically neutralized by centralized and concentrated heavy artillery fire. The armies on the Western Front spent the next 4 years trying to coordinate ever more complicated attacks to break trench networks of increasing depth and complexity. It was this rapid and constant innovation rather than stodgy conservatism that created the bloody stalemate on the Western Front. In 15, the trench battles in its early position. 1915 saw a staggering number of battles on the Western Front, especially compared to 1916, when the combatants became embroiled in a pair of mammoth efforts within discrete geographical limits, the Somme and Verdun. To an extent, however, this is misleading. The Western Front was constantly simmering with low-level violence, producing daily casualties that were lumped together with losses due to disease or the environment as mere wastage. Even the grand battles of 1916 and 17 can only be described as such because of their geography. There were frequent lulls in combat and sometimes dozens of smaller battles within the larger battles. The Somme is replete with smaller battles that separate engagements from the wider operation. Given the constraints of time and space, this article can only provide quick snapshots of parts of the front. Keep in mind that other parts were simultaneously active. The French launched the first attack in Champagne on 16 February 1915. The first Battle of Champagne in many ways set the precedent, and a poor one, for the shape of offensives in 1915. The French managed an acceptable initial advance and then spent a month relentlessly hammering against a solidified German line to no avail. In all, upwards of 2 lakh French soldiers were killed or wounded for a modest advance. No more than 3 kilometers in the most successful sectors, the Germans suffered only 80,000 casualties in defense. Undaunted, the French continued to launch and maintain such attacks throughout the year, making 1915 the deadliest year for French forces. 3,49,000 deaths. The British, for their part, did not remain idle, but could not commit nearly as many troops as their French ally. They made a series of largely abortive efforts to support larger French battles. The Battle of Neuchâtel, 10 to 13 March 1915, stands out as the only truly independent effort. The small-scale battle, whilst initially successful, eventually petered out, with British troops unable to capitalize on their initial gains. This was a long-standing problem in trench warfare. The initial break-in was not too complicated for well-supplied troops to active. Doing anything with that initial break-in, however, proved exceedingly difficult. The Germans suffered a similar fate the next month in their attempt to test the trenches on the Western Front. The Germans, whose focus was overwhelmingly on the Eastern Front in 1915, where they won a series of stunning victories over Russian forces, making the largest sustained advance of the war, instigated one battle on the Western Front in 1915, rather than hoping that the battle would win some grand strategic victory. The Second Battle of Ypres, 22 April 25 May 1915, was largely designed as a testing ground for a new weapon of war, poison gas. German forces had secretly installed a series of chemical tanks across their lines trenches on 22 April 1915, released their deadly chlorine gas to waft over to the French and British trenches opposite them. Where the gas fell thickest, the Allied line simply melted away. French African colonial troops, named Tirailleurs Sénégalais, fell back in disorganized panic. On their flank, Canadian troops held on doggedly for days. Isolated and repeatedly attacked by German forces, and tent forces were able to recover from the momentary collapse, due largely to the lack of German effort. Unconvinced that the gas would be as effective as it proved, the Germans had no plan in place to exploit any possible breach in the Allied lines. The result after weeks was again a minor territorial gain of no strategic importance for tens of thousands of casualties. The rest of 1915 followed this pattern with few exceptions. The French Moroccan Division and the 77th Division managed an advance of 4.5 kilometers on the opening day of the Second Battle of Artois, 9 May to 18 June. But this initial breakthrough could not be capitalized upon. The French had hoped to capture Vimy Ridge and Notre Dame de Lorette, dominating high ground north of Arras. Notre Dame de Lorette was captured by the end of the battle, but Vimy remained in German hands until April 1917, when it was finally captured by Canadian forces. The French launched attacks in the Woevre and Les Eparges to no effect. Even the largest coordinated Allied battle since the Marne proved ineffective. On 25 September 1915, the French attacked simultaneously in the Champagne Artois, while the British attacked in the direction of the Luce using the same chlorine gas tactics the Germans had pioneered months earlier. Despite some initial advances, especially in Champagne by the French Second Army under Philippe Pétain, 1856-1951, these efforts supported and failed to meet the Allied commanders' lofty goals. The repeated failure and excessive cost for the Entente, especially from the French attacks, shaped German strategy for the following year. The 1916 attritional battles, coming to power in September 14 after the mental collapse of the predecessor, Helmut von Moltke, the grand nephew of the brilliant Prussian strategist of the same name, Erich von Falkenhayn, 1861-1922, inherited a difficult strategic position. A natural pessimist, taciturn, and secretive, he viewed Germany's strategic position with deep consternation. Fighting on two fronts against forces vastly more numerous than his own and propping up the weak, underdeveloped allies, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, shackled to a corpse. As the saying goes, Falkenhayn knew that Germany was incapable of winning a prolonged war on two fronts. Germany's only hope lay in forcing at least one of its enemies to the negotiating table as quickly as possible. After the dramatic success against Russia, the Eastern Front had some appeal. But Falkenhayn feared that further hammering of Russian forces into the Russian interior, which dangerously stretched German logistics, was no guarantee of victory. In the best-case scenario, Germany would only be worsening its logistical and strategic problems. For Falkenhayn, the best hope for the knocking at least one of Germany's enemies out of the war lay in the West. Falkenhayn knew that he did not have enough forces to pummel the French into submission or to push the British back into the sea. Even if he had, the inherent strength of field fortification meant that such an effort would be unduly costly for Germany and perhaps lead to nothing more than a Pyrrhic victory. The strategic losses the French suffered in 1915 were well understood by German strategists. It was here that Falkenhayn placed his hopes, if he could force the French to attack with the same ferocity and lack of success as they had in 1915, the French Republic could prove incapable of bearing the burden and forced to sue for peace. Such a peace would rob Britain of its operating bases in France and likely compel them to sue for peace in their own time, or at least remove the threat posed by the growing British army. This would free up German forces to fight Russia in Eastern Europe, where they stood to annex enormous tracts of land. The Lebensraum that would tantalize extremist German strategists in both world wars. The trick was to put German forces in a position where the French would have no choice but to attack, and to continue to attack, whatever the cost. Falkenhayn deduced that the ancient fort of Verdun would be just the spot. Having existed in various forms since Roman times, the fort at Verdun had been France's bulwark against the Germans for centuries. Before either nation existed in its modern form, it was supposedly a national symbol that the French could not let pass into German hands, although this interpretation has become increasingly contentious. Counting on this, Falkenhayn launched his attack on 21st February 1916. This was a strategic offensive that relied on the strength of the tactical defensive. The French and German armies grappled for the next 10 months in the longest land battle in history, the Battle of Verdun. Verdun, known as the Meuse Mill, for the river next to which the battle was fought, remains emblematic of the war on the Western Front. From a German perspective, the battle, at least as originally conceived, had but one purpose: to kill as many French soldiers as possible. This was attrition, conceived in its purest form. The casualties were enormous, although fewer than one might expect from such a battle. Ultimately, some 3 lakh soldiers from each army were killed or wounded. The battlefield conditions were barbaric. Troops were led mechanistically into an ever-grinding machine of fire, steel, mud, and death. French troops felt that the battle was a futile waste of lives. They expressed what they felt was the obvious lack of value placed on their lives by bleating like sheep being led to the slaughter as they marched into the Verdun salient, a bone-chilling foreshadowing of the widespread mutinies that would wreck the French army in 1917. The situation for German forces was hardly better. Whereas French forces were rapidly and aggressively rotated in and out of the front, ensuring that troops did not have to endure more than a few days at the hellish front. German units were frequently left at the front for weeks on end. This horrific treatment, partially a response to overstretched German logistics, but also based on the belief that German troops could handle it, severely shaped German morale and fighting power. Nevertheless, the Germans very nearly pushed the French to the breaking point. Philippe Pétain, in charge of the Battle of Verdun from 26 February to 1916, demanded that a strong offensive be launched elsewhere in order to draw German forces away from his beleaguered troops. The battle became notorious in its own right, the Battle of the Somme. Contrary to popular belief that the Somme was purely a reaction to Verdun, the battle had in fact been agreed upon as a joint Anglo-French battle in December 1915. Months before the German attack at Verdun changed the strategic dynamic of the Allied forces. The Battle of the Somme was an opportunity for the rapidly expanding British army, swelled with volunteers raised in part by the efforts of the Secretary of State of War, Lord Horatio Herbert Kitchener, 1850 to 1916, giving them the appellation Kitchener's Army, to finally commit troops to battle on a truly continental scale. Although initially planned as another French-led battle, the Battle of the Somme became the first battle-led effort. This was in large part due to the fact that French forces were worn down in the fighting around Verdun. The only problem was that the British Army and its leader, Douglas Haig, 1861 to 1928, did not feel ready to attack, worried about the hurried manner in which these new armies were trained, and unwilling to commit his forces to combat before they were ready. Haig ideally wanted to wait until August. Unfortunately, armies are forced to make war as they must, not as they would like. The attack began on 1st July 1916. The Somme Verdun was the largest battle and the longest battle on the Western Front in 1916, but the Somme was the bloodiest. It sent nearly twice as many men to their graves in half the time as the Meuse Mill. In many ways, the Somme was the archetypal Western Front battle. Many of the persistent myths and stereotypes of the First World War come from the battle or are at least attributed to it. The image of British soldiers crossing no man's land at a walking pace are largely inspired by the actions of some British until 1st July 1916. For many Britons, the war is symbolized by the Somme. It was a microcosm of the murder, blood and horror that the war is remembered for. The battle, however, was never meant to be led by the British. Its initial form, roughly sketched out at the Chantilly Conference in 1915, force of 40 French divisions supported by 25 British. As was true of the battles in 1915, it was French-led, with British support. The version of the Battle of Somme was quickly chewed up on the banks of the Meuse. By the time the battle actually began, the French contribution was a mere 12 divisions. It was the British Army that acted as the senior partner. This not only marked an important change in the relationship between the two allies, Britain and could thereafter rightfully demand more independence. It was also a chance for the British Army and its new Commander-in-Chief, Douglas Haig, to establish their reputations. General Henry Rawlinson, 1864 to 1925, at the head of British Fourth Army, had tactical command of the battle. In practice, however, Haig found it difficult to avoid micromanaging him, keenly aware that his own reputation was Rawlinson's hands. Haig and Rawlinson viewed the goals at the Somme differently. Rawlinson sought to maximize the chance of success for his largely unblooded forces. This meant lowering the expectations for what any one attack could accomplish and relying on firepower rather than manpower to overcome stiff enemy defenses. Haig, however, felt that this approach was too cautious. He recognized the need for dense artillery bombardment to precede any attack, but was unwilling to limit the advance to a single line of enemy trenches, as Rawlinson wanted. The reasons for this are complicated, but are in large part due to the pressures of command at the strategic level. For Rawlinson, a tactical victory was enough. If the Somme was tactical success, if it could point to the capture of some notable town, ridge, hillock, or village, and was not too costly, he could justifiably consider his work to have been successful. For Haig, whose position meant tackling the often diametrically opposed demands of subordinate officers, superiors in Whitehall, and the strategic imperatives of his allies, especially France, a minor tactical success could mean a strategic or political defeat. If his allies or political masters felt he was not doing enough to further their strategic goals, he could well find himself on the chopping block. This pressure often led strategic commanders to overreach the tactical capabilities of their armies. Haig's overreach in 1916 reaped the single worst in British military history. On July 1, 1916, at 7:30 am, some 55,000 French and British troops went over the top in the initial wave of the assault across a 16-mile front, signaling the start of the Battle of the Somme. Their success was variable. In the southern sector, French and British troops advanced rapidly, captured their objectives, and solidified their position at minimal cost. To the north, British formations were known down, capturing very little and sustaining heavy casualties. With concentrated machine gun fire, effective pre-sighted artillery barrages, and barbed wire replacements that were frequently still intact, the Germans in the northern part of the battlefield easily repulsed British attacks. The persistent cultural myth of British soldiers slowly walking across no man's land in serried ranks only to be mown down by enemy fire are largely a faint memory of the sad realities some units faced on 1st July 1916 on the Somme. Attacking battalions in front of Serre suffered over 50% casualties, an absolute catastrophe. The Newfoundlanders lost 91% of their forces that day attacking Beaumont Hamel. Secondary waves faced deadly fire before even reaching the British front line, forced to march over open terrain due to the communication trenches already clogged with the dead and dying. They made easy targets to German artillery and machine guns, which sometimes engaged British infantry at ranges of over half a mile. It is easy to understand why the First World War is seen as futile when recounting incidents like these. By the end of the day, British forces had suffered 56,882 casualties, including 19,240 dead. Despite gains in the southern sector, the overall result fell crushingly short of the success Haig and Rawlinson had hoped for. To their south, French forces under Ferdinand IV, 1851-1921, and Emile Fiolet, 1852 to 1928, did better, capturing all their objectives for the day with the loss of only 1,590 casualties. The French, able to resume the attack the next day, eagerly did so. The British required time to recover physically, morally, and spiritually. Of course, the Battle of the Somme was far larger than the events of a single day. The French and British continued to attack vigorously through to December. All told, the battle claimed around 1.2 million casualties, roughly 6 lakh from the German army and a combined 6 lakh from the Entente, roughly 4 lakh British and 2 lakh French. Through this great bloodletting, the British learned hard lessons in modern warfare. The Somme set the stage for the string of impressive battlefield successes the Army achieved in 1917 and in 1918. Tanks were first used at Falaise-Courcelette on 15 September 1916, forever changing the face of the warfare. French troops twice broke through the German lines and for a brief moment found themselves with no immediate obstacles between their position and the fields of Picardy and Berlin. However, these local successes, the result of a relentless, methodical, operational hammering at the German lines, led to naught. If the Allies were to beat Imperial Germany, it was going to have to happen some other way. If we take a step back and examine the whole of 1916 on the Western Front, the picture is somewhat mixed. 1916 was by far the worst year that the Germans or British had suffered. Germany lost twice as many men on the Western Front in 1916 as it had in 1915. Britain lost several times more than then the size of the entire British expeditionary force in 1914. France did markedly better, however, losing barely more than half as many casualties in 1916 as they had in 1915. Despite these high casualty rates, neither side achieved their strategic objectives. Falkenhayn decided to bleed France white. At Verdun field, the French and Germans suffered roughly equal casualties, and French morale was not broken. On the contrary, despite the heavy pressure at Verdun, the French were able to take part in the Battle of the Somme, eventually sending more men to fight there than Britain did over the course of the battle, and inflicting far more casualties on the Germans than they suffered themselves. Similarly, Joffrey's stated goal of destroying the German and Austro-Hungarian armies was not achieved. These strategic shortcomings were not without their repercussions. Haig managed to survive through to the end of the war, but both Joffrey and Falkenhayn lost their jobs. Joffrey was promoted to a position in which he had no real authority over French operations, the traditional way of gracefully moving a military commander out of the way. Falkenhayn, perhaps less insultingly, was given a field command again, where he conducted successful operations against Romania in 1917 and later commanded troops in Palestine in an attempt to bolster the crumbling Ottoman forces' fight against the British invading from Egypt. In their places, Robert Nivelle, 1856-1924, took over for France. Nivelle had seen to prominence after retaking Fort. The Dormont in October 1916, while the team of Erich Ludendorff, 1865-1937, and Paul von Hindenburg, 1847-1934, took over for Germany. Their appointment shaped the fighting in crucial ways in 1917. The 1917, the year of desperation. 17 was in many ways a desperate year for both the Allies and the Germans, faced with continued encirclement, a biting blockade, and struggling allies. German war leaders needed to knock at least one of the great powers out of the war as quickly as possible to stand any chance of even a conditional negotiated victory. Hindenburg and Ludendorff chose to continue operations in the theater of war where they had earned their fame, the Eastern Front. Russia was by far the weakest of the three major Entente powers, and Germany had already pushed Russian forces deep into their own territory. Peace with Russia would free up millions of German soldiers who might be able to tip the balance in Germany's favor on the Western Front. Such an attack would require concentrated manpower from an already overstretched German army to help free the men for the coming offensive. Hindenburg and Ludendorff withdrew forces to the so-called Hindenburg Line. Siegfried Stellung's around the Noyon salient in France in early 1917. This new line of fortifications both shortened the length of the frontage Germany had to man and was well protected by concrete bunkers and well planned out defensives and the arrays. These further economized on manpower and were quite difficult for the Entente powers to break through. In the short to medium term, the Hindenburg Line solved a number of important strategic and tactical issues the Germans faced in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of the Somme. The remaining issues of the Western Front will be discussed afterward in the second lecture of new video.